This is an audio summary of Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 through 22, and chapter 16, verses 18 through 20, the heart of the matter. October 1st, 2023, week 5. Welcome, viewers and subscribers, to my channel, The Backstory and More. This is an audio summary of the Sunday school lesson. If this summary is of any value or benefit to you, please subscribe. This first summary covers Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 through 22. God's requirements for Israel were summarized in terms of four things the people must do: fear, walk, love, and serve. What verse 12 does not clarify is the precise relationship between these terms as Moses used them. It is tempting to think of these four imperatives as distinct actions and then to interpret each one in light of the aspect of its meaning that do not overlap with the meanings of the others. For example, to walk in his ways would focus on living a moral and holy life. To love him would emphasize emotional attachment to God. But another way of interpreting this verse, which takes almost an exact opposite approach, is probably the better way to understand this. This method holds that the intended meaning of each action is what all of them have in common. If we were to sketch their meanings in terms of four overlapping circles, the core meaning in this passage would be where they all overlap. Each imperative may bring unique elements, but these are not the focus. Verse 13 shows us that this overlap meaning approach is probably intended as it completes the thought of verse 12 with the introduction of a fifth imperative: observe. This imperative stands out from the previous four as the organizing principle of those imperatives. The Israelites cannot claim to fear the Lord, walk in his ways, love him, or serve him if they refuse to observe or keep his commandments. A careful reading of the rest of Deuteronomy confirms this interpretation. One way to see this is to note every occurrence of the idea of doing something with all one's heart and soul. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, loving God with one's heart, soul, and strength is linked with keeping God's commandments. In chapter 11, verse 13, heeding God's commands is linked with loving God and serving him with all one's heart and soul. The unifying principle in these passages is obedience to God's command. This principle is the core message of Deuteronomy as a whole. Moses called the Israelites of the second generation to align their lives with the commands set forth in this book. God entrusted to them the keys to the blessed life. He gave them inside information about the way this world is designed to operate. Their mission involved living this out so convincingly that God could use them as a wellness to all nations. Moses reminded the Israelites of their special place in God's heart. God had chosen the Israelite forefathers and their descendants to be uniquely his. He could have chosen a nation that was already fully established in its land. He could have chosen a nation with a powerful army to subdue his enemies, but he chose the Israelites. Moses began to encapsulate God's requirements. The first step was to reaffirm the utter superiority and majesty of Israel's God above all pretender gods and lords. Moses was teaching the people that God's own character, unlike the character of any ruler or god they had previously known, was the foundation to the commands by which he called them to live. For example, he defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner. God had exhibited his love for foreigners by choosing a bunch of foreigners in Egypt to be his people. If the Israelites were going to bear witness to God's love, they must also love strangers. In the next few verses, Moses echoed much of what he had already said, with an emphasis on exclusivity. Though the Israelites were to be hospitable to strangers, they also were to remain firm in their rejection of rival gods and rival masters. They were to be set apart as God's people. Now for a brief summary of Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 18 through 20. Whenever people live and work together, differences will exist and tensions will arise. God made provision to deal with such difficulties in the life of Israel. Judges and officials were to be selected. The open area inside a city was a forum where public business was transacted. People could bring their disputes to the judges there, where an open and public hearing was conducive to a just or righteous judgment. Such a judgment would not be made out of partiality for a poor man just because he was poor, or for a rich man because he was rich. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 15. Neither would it be swayed by a bribe. Moses wrapped up this summary of God's law with a rhetorical flourish that doesn't always translate well into English. The first part of this verse literally reads, "Justice, justice, you shall pursue." It is a passionate plea that reflects a sense of urgency. The reason is clear in the second half of the verse. The people's very lives and presence in the promised land were riding on it. Thank you so much for listening. Join me soon for the next audio summary of the Sunday School lesson. Stay safe and may God bless.